Sometimes you see something and an idea begins to form in the back of your mind. You have no way of knowing where it's going to go, but something tweaks your imagination. And that's what happened when our corkscrew hazel bush died a few years back. Here I've cut some of the longer pieces off because I have an idea about the shape this is going to take. And what I'm going to do before I actually stabilize it with the epoxy coating is I'm gluing a few of the limbs together, and because they're together they're going to act as one member, so it will make it significantly stronger than acting all as individual little sprouts. Cutting off some of the branches was maybe a bit difficult, but more difficult was actually drilling into the trunk to provide a place to have the metal rod. And of course I wanted to chisel that and make it look absolutely perfect, even though in reality no one would see it. What I did is set up a piece of old plexiglass to get an idea of what it would look like and to act as a template to try to figure out how I would possibly form this. And this is before I decided I would form it upside down. After doing that, I got a piece of melamine and laid the template over it and identified where I could put the hole for the branch that went through it. Now I have to think of everything upside down because of course this is the mold that I'm going to make to pour the epoxy. And actually looking at the branch, I do notice that the wood looks a little bit like cherry or maybe maple, well, once you actually cut into it. But more on that later. Now when I actually put the wood into the form, I realized that I'd have to do a really good job of putting the pieces together and sealing them, because I've had epoxy emergencies before and it gets all over everything, and I didn't want to have to replace my desk and my workbench again because I have epoxy all over that. So me and epoxy, we have a bit of history, and goes back quite a while. I can't tell you the number of times it seemed like this project was attacking me and I was getting poked and prodded seemingly every time I turned around by all the branches. Now, using the form upside down meant that I needed to put something in the bottom so that the epoxy would release. Now, it may not have been the smartest thing to do casting it upside down, but at the time I really didn't know another way to get it so that the branch would stick through the table. Of course I could have cut it, and part of the way through the process I figured that I should have actually done that. Then I could have cast it normally and I would have saved myself probably many days of casting. But putting the form together after that went fairly straightforward. I had to leave a little bit of space underneath each one of the points so that the epoxy would run underneath and it provides sufficient attachment so that it would support the top. Pouring went pretty well. I mixed up 2 full liters of epoxy, and honestly it didn't go as far as I thought. I did the calculations. I knew I'd have to do multiple pours, but the biggest challenge that I found was getting the form level and having it stay level. Now, because if form is even a degree out, you'll find that epoxy will run to one side, being very liquid, and so it was a bit of a battle going back and forth to try to figure out if indeed the small adjustments I were making were helping or hurting to make the epoxy try to be as true as possible and flat in the form. This took a number of days, and I had to go back and pour several times before I got it to the level I was happy with. Well, I've been waiting for this moment for a long time. I put together what I think is going to work when I actually pull the bottom of the form off. You can see it here. But I have this cutout which encloses this branch which runs through the top of the table. And building it the way I did, I think it's going to work. I'm not sure it's going to work, but I am a little worried. I guess as worried as you could be about an inanimate object that you've spent many hours on. So we're going to try to give it a go and see if it actually does release from the form, and see what the whole thing looks like when the last piece of the formwork is removed.
Removing the form, the bottom piece of the form, was a little harder than I thought, and maybe the film that I used for the release maybe didn't work as well, but by using these shims and going around the piece, I was able to slowly pry it off and get it to release in the end. Even though this took a long time, I'm glad I did it this way, because I think maybe getting a crowbar under there like I wanted to do might not have been the best idea, given what I've found out about how rigid epoxy is. Finally, pulling off the last piece proved a bit more difficult, so I had to resort to getting out power tool just to make a seam so it would release easier around the branch. This was a bit nerve-wracking here. I obviously didn't want to bust up the table surface or have the form snap and take out the branch, which I'd obviously worked so hard to protect. Now sometimes you end up going down a path where you spend a lot of time trying to get something to work, but in the end you think about it, you're like, well, why didn't I cut the protruding branch, form the table surface, and then seam that back in? However, there was a problem. The epoxy wasn't rigid enough, and I needed to do something to stabilize it. I picked up some, actually 3/8 inch hot rolled steel, and measured out a frame and had John weld it up. I couldn't have all four sides of the frame welded because I still needed to somehow thread it in between the branches when I brought it back and assembled the whole thing. I once thought about learning how to weld, but John's been welding for 60 years, and it's much easier to have him do it rather than me try to buy a welding kit and possibly cause great harm to myself as well as property trying to learn this. When I put it back together and then flipped it over, I realized I had a ton of sanding to do to remove all the imperfections that were left from the bottom of the form, as well as small areas where there were bubbles or imprints that needed to be removed. As you imagine, this took quite a while.
Many unbearable hours later.
Much later.
So I suppose that I should have known how much repair work this is going to take based on other projects I've done, but for some reason I didn't really calculate quite how much scraping and sanding I'd have to do. I'll just pause here while you enjoy the sounds of scraping and sanding for your listening pleasure. So in the end, the final product worked out okay. The actual branch does go through the table, I didn't have to cut it, and with the steel bracing, it is reasonably strong and rigid, although there are some things I wouldn't recommend doing, such as standing on this table during a party. However, that's not really what the intent was. It was a bit of an experiment to see if indeed this could support a table and could integrate something as organic as this into a flat table surface. So I think on that aspect it has succeeded. And I also learned quite a bit from the process, working with epoxy, steel, as well as something which is a non-traditional support. Oh, but by the way, the new owner absolutely loves it and has posted it on Facebook already, and there's more than a few people who asked her, how the heck did that get built? Thanks for tuning in, and for more, please subscribe and leave a comment in the comment box below. Thanks for watching.